keep your voice down. Have no fear. Amy Rose is here.
How'd you get here?
Well, if you gotta know, I caught a ride with Tails. Are you sure you don't need my help? It looks like you could use it.
The reason I'm in here is because of that fake hedgehog.
You mean that black hedgehog?
Did you see it? Where is it now?
If I tell ya, will you marry me?
No way!
I thought I had you this time. That black hedgehog came here with Dr. Eggman.
So, Eggman's behind this, huh?
What's all that writing on the wall anyway? Did you write that? Wait for me, Sonic! He's such a brat sometimes.
This is where it all started to go downhill. Not with Sonic Adventure 1, but 2. A lot of fans actually adore this game, and I have to admit, I do like it. I just don't love it. There are still some things in it that I hate. First off, let's start with the tone. There's this funny little thing we've seen a little too much of everywhere this past decade called serious business. The idea behind serious business is that making something dark and bleak somehow makes it better, cooler, or more mature. Sometimes a transition like this is executed well, but most of the time it isn't. There are so many games everywhere that are just oozing with this serious business that gets really stale after a while. Simply adding violence and whatnot isn't genuine maturity. It doesn't make a game appear to be more grown up, except to people with no taste. If anything, it's cheap, generic, and does nothing to make a game unique or original. It's like a 14-year-old acting out and dressing up in a strange manner, trying so hard to be a badass in the eyes of the world and his drunk pals, but he's a dumbass in the eyes of his folks. Aside from the profoundly bleak, utterly lifeless, but more genuinely tragic world of Sonic CD, this is one of Sonic's darkest adventures ever. This game takes itself so seriously that it's almost silly and childish. There are those who don't like the idea that everything needs to be made dark and serious in a contrived attempt to appeal to the mainstream masses beyond those who simply like Sonic. Me, well, I actually kinda like it. Call me crazy, but I like serious business, just not a lot of it. I don't think there should ever be another game like this again, but I do think it was okay this one time. One thing that really irks me is the idea that this is our world. Screw that. Take a look back at the Genesis games and even Sonic Adventure. Those didn't try to be realistic. Those were beautifully crafted dreamlands where you could escape our world. Throwing Sonic into our world doesn't make him easier to connect to, it distances him from us, because he's such a weird, out-of-place thing next to us humans. Sonic is the embodiment of nature, fantasy, and escapism. I always thought there must have been some humans lurking in the shadows of the Genesis games, but this is our modern-day Earth. Going by the storyline of the Archie Sonic comics, which I've always loved and probably always will, Mobius is really just our world 1,000 years or so in the future, and in that time all the little woodland critters evolved into humanoid shapes. But while the comic cannot exist without the games exist without the comic. The two are not really connected. This is simply one of Sega's piss-poor attempts at inserting Sonic the Hedgehog into the real world. The last thing any Sonic game needs is some president who only exists to shove it in our faces that this is our world and not some wonderfully surreal fantasy land. It hurts me to see that the wonderfully wacky Green Hills somehow exist just outside what might as well be San Francisco. Hell, they even go ahead and call it Earth instead of Mobius. I know it's always been called Earth in Japan, but seriously, it's just too unbearably terrestrial. If the humans still look something like anime characters like they did in the first Sonic Adventure, their presence would be forgivable, because they'd be cartoony, but Sega just had to make them look like real people, making Sonic and the others feel even more out of place than they already did. I do love the storyline though. Link meets Shadow Link. Sonic meets Shadow. That's it. See, I actually like Shadow. I know that'll piss off a lot of you guys, but listen, don't click that back button just yet. Shadow is like an eclipse. It's cool for a while, but it shouldn't last for long. Shadow should have been special, but at this point, he is an overused wad of fanservice who does not need to be in any of the games he is in. But in this game, he has an interesting story that affects everyone else in the game. His existence makes shit go down for everybody else. He's a walking catastrophe. He's like an anomaly. By all means, he shouldn't exist, and yet, here he is, and I love him for it. Some would consider Metal Sonic to be Sonic's true evil twin, and Shadow is more like a clone. Sure, he has nifty shoes and looks like a hard ass, but he really is just supersonic with black fur, red highlights, tan skin, and a tuft of white hair on his chest. Character-wise, Shadow is the emo stereotype, in the eyes of those who don't understand him. But he's anything but. See, an emo is someone who does their best not to let themselves feel anything, to be emotionless because they think it makes them appear badass somehow. But strangely, Shadow has more emotion than most of the other characters. He just doesn't bother to show it at first. His limitless power is fueled by a tragic love lost in the only way he can interpret it. Here's how the story goes. For those of you who somehow don't know by now, Shadow was created on board the Space Colony Ark several decades before any other Sonic game begins, where Robotnik's ancestor, Professor Gerald Robotnik, wanted to find a way to cure a disease previously thought to be uncurable. If he could somehow create this ultimate life force that would unlock the secrets needed to save his granddaughter Maria Robotnik from her own terminal illness, well, that would all be just fine and dandy, wouldn't it? But the big bad human military found out and decided to blow shit up. Maria saved Shadow by ejecting him from the colony just as she was shot to death by some stupid human soldier, and the poor widowed sourpuss was traumatized. Half a century later, Robotnik storms into a military base in order to find his family's fabled inheritance. Upon being awakened, Shadow vows revenge. He has completely lost faith in humanity. Ugh, humans, why, Sega? And fools like head into thinking he'll help the Mad Dog rule the world with a giant space cannon powered by the Emeralds. Because Sonic and Shadow apparently look so much alike, the big bad humans get confused and Sonic goes to prison. Eventually, his friends break him out. Knuckles decides to tag along, and they make their way to the Ark. Sonic manages to shut the cannon down, but it turns out the colony had another function. Gerald went insane, and made the Ark to smash into the Earth and wipe out humanity. Fortunately, Amy says some things that trigger some memories that Shadow repressed, revealing that Maria always had faith in humanity. This sparks a flame within Shadow, and he works with Sonic to defeat a giant lizard thingamajiggy version of Shadow. They go super and warp the colony back into orbit where it belongs. Shadow then falls through the atmosphere, supposedly dying a beautiful death. A lot of people dismiss this as a pathetic excuse for a revenge story, but the game and its story is more atmospheric and genuinely engaging than they give it credit for. I love certain scenes like the one where Sonic is broken out of prison, don't know why he couldn't just spin dash to the bars, and it turns out that was Gerald's cell, where you can see old footage of him being executed in a later scene. This is great stuff. The idea that this is the real world does make this game suffer, but aside from that, it's pretty interesting. Shadow had little to no contact with anyone who wasn't poking and prodding him to see how he ticked, and Maria, who looks ghastly in this game by the way, was everything to him. She was the one thing precious to him in the vastness of space. She was his mother, his sister, his friend, his guardian, and her demise is what started all the crazy shit that happens throughout this game. I just think it's so neat that this tiny flicker of a life and death is what started all this. If Shadow never appeared again, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But I like him in this game. If he had only appeared this one time, he might be more special to the masses. However, just his existence began a horrendous fad that will probably never end. Recolors! I have seen so many supposedly original characters that look just like existing characters, but with new color schemes and sometimes new shoes, or a different number of spikes. This isn't creative. I mean, for an evil version of Sonic, you don't want to make him look too different, but there are countless recolors that exist because this guy made people think it's okay. Want to see an original character? Here. This is a character I made up. Basilisk the Morelia. He's a python with mechanical arms. Haven't seen one of those in the games, huh? Here's another one. I call him Beat the Hippopotamus. He's a wad of concentrated coolness I made just for the hell of it, but that's a lot more original than a lot of the recolored lumps of shit that infest the internet and are going to for a very, very long time. I know those of you watching this video who have made your own recolored OCs are going to give me a lot of grief for this, but it has to be said. If you're going to bother making a fan character, it doesn't have to be a hedgehog or a fox or a bat, and if you can't draw, don't bother using Photoshop to recolor someone from the games, hoping this will ultimately make you a beloved fanfic writer or internet celebrity. But anyway, back to the game. I also like Rouge the Bat, another new character. Not as much for obvious reasons, being the cute little bundle of sex that she is. I just think the giant ears and the bat wings on her back that are separate from her arms are cool. She proved herself to be fearless and creative, although she's kind of a narcissist, and was able to handle herself most of the time. I liked her little fling with Knuckles, and I can't help but wonder whatever happened to that. Though I guess you could say that ever since Shadow forgot to die, she's been leaning toward him instead. I know a lot of you hate this couple, but whatever. In the end, they're both just fan service at this point, and they can have each other. The layout of this game's story isn't as complicated as that of SA1. There are still 6 playable characters, but this time there are only 2 sides of the story to follow, not 6. Because of this, you automatically switch characters between zones. Each character only visits a stage once. Some stages are similar to others, many existing in the same regions, but no one visits the exact same spots anymore. There are over 30 stages, while SA1 had only about a dozen if you include Sand Hill. Most characters get about 5 chances to play. Each story has 3 characters, so it's Sonic vs. Shadow, Knuckles vs. Rouge, and Old Egghead vs. Tails. Yep, that's right, you get to play as Robotnik. Isn't that just beyond awesome? Don't get the wrong idea though, there aren't 6 ways to play, there are 3. Tails and Robotnik both control something like Gamma from SA1, Knuckles and Rouge control just like each other, and Shadow's like Sonic's evil twin clone thingamajig, duh. Here's where the gameplay fails. A good Sonic game has lots of platforming, exploration, and speed. These 3 elements are present here, but not together. Rather than a healthy, universal blend of all 3, this game separates them, and emphasizes each to a ridiculous extent. Tails and Robotnik had almost all the platforming, Knuckles and Rouge had almost all the exploration, and Sonic and Shadow are mostly speed. I say mostly because even in Sonic and Shadow's levels, there are still some little bits of platforming here and there, and a few alternate paths to explore, but not nearly as much as there was in the first Sonic adventure. They've been engineered and constructed to feel like a wicked racetrack to perform totally radical stunts on. Aside from those of Knuckles and Rouge, most of these stages are horrendously linear. In fact, most of the exploring was devoted to collecting so many level up items that these guys start to look like freaking cyborgs after a while, though Robotnik's walker still improves in appearance as you upgrade it. Some of these items, such as Sonic's magic gloves, are silly, and as these items pile up, they start to make them look like cluster effers. When this game first came out on the Dreamcast, Sonic and Shadow's levels were very well received because they were, you guessed it, fast. And as we all know, that is the only thing that matters in a Sonic game, isn't it? I know they wanted the different characters to play differently and not have it all feel the same, but they took it too far. When this game isn't a cheap roller coaster ride with more automated loops, rockets, and speed boosters than ever, it's an honestly boring treasure hunt. And I even enjoyed those a little bit in SA1, but still, these don't feel quite right. These stages are kind of fun and challenging in their own little ways, but they just don't feel as whole as they would if all 3 elements were blended together into a perfect 3D Sonic game. It feels like one great game that was split apart into 3 lesser, separate, incomplete games that simply don't function or complement each other as well as the scattered fragments they are. And this is just a little thing, but only Rouge and Knuckles can swim. Anyone else who falls into the water instantly dies. Screw that. In all these years, we still have yet to see an interesting 3D underwater stage with underwater platforming. SA1 and 2 are the only games that ever came even close to that. If I ever made a 3D Sonic game with, say, 20 stages, I would make sure there'd be at least 2 or 3 cool underwater stages. What we do get in SA2 with Knuckles is pretty interesting, though. The homing attack is back, but it's been amplified in a totally negative way. The first Sonic adventure didn't have a lot of this, but there are many points in Sonic and Shadow's levels where you're expected to use a homing attack on a bunch of enemies arbitrarily placed to bridge a gap. This is stupid. All you're doing is tapping one button again and again and again and again to repeatedly teleport yourself a short distance. And even though it's possible to press it at a bad time and send yourself down to furry hell, it really isn't hard. This would appear in a lot of later Sonic games, and some even dare to call this some innovative new form of platforming, but it's barely interactive and disgustingly repetitive. It's cheap, and there's simply no way around it. I like using the bounce bracelet to reach greater heights, and it's kind of fun smashing through boxes that are in my way and occasionally using the homing attack on a spring that's ever so conveniently placed, but this is just a cop-out. There is one more gameplay element I might as well talk about. Grinding.
You did your homework, is that it? I would say that's an invasion of privacy.
I could say the same thing about you.
Looks like things aren't quite going your way, but since My job was done. I thought it was time to take what's mine and get out of this place.
One pathetic creature.
Look who's talking. What about you? Here are the results of the research project called the Ultimate Life Form. But if this picture is of the real ultimate life form named Shadow, then exactly who or what is standing in front of me?
This is Dr. Eggman. I have found all 7 Chaos Emeralds. Shit. Someone is trying to get the Eclipse cannon. There's not much time left before the cannon fires again. Can you get over that?
If you want to live, leave the Chaos Emeralds where they are. The fake emerald is good enough for you.
Do you actually believe that you're the real Shadow?
No
Even
doubt.
your memories might not be real, you know?
Even if my memories are not real, it's still me, Shadow. And I will fulfill my promise to Maria. That's the only thing that matters to me now.
I think this was the only time grinding was ever fun. In most of the other games, 3D and 2D alike, grinding is an automated function that propels you forward, leaving you little to no control over how you move once you've touched a grind rail as you simply watch Sonic move. In Sonic Heroes it was still okay, but we'll get into that next time. In this game, you can crouch to reduce wind resistance and build up more momentum, something like crouching instead of running in Sonic 1. You can tilt left or right a little bit, and depending on how well you handle yourself, you can throw yourself into an abyss or have a blast soaring through the skies. Grinding is extremely tricky, and a lot of people hate it because they just can't figure it out. But once you master it, it becomes very rewarding. Sound familiar? Unlike in future games, grinding has its own physics, and honestly, as weird as it sounds, out of all the stages in this game, Final Rush is the only stage that feels remotely like anything like the Genesis games to me. I know a lot of you are thinking, what? But think about it. As bad for a Sonic game as grind rails ultimately are, and there are a lot of them in this level, there's lots of platforming, wide open spaces, lots of alternate routes, and the momentum-based physics of grinding in this game make this one stage feel more like a big playground rather than a linear racetrack. This is the only stage I think was done right out of the whole game. Only this one stage out of 35 feels whole and not fragmented or incomplete. The whole game should have been engineered something like this. Some of you might have a hard time with it, considering the entire level is just one unending bottomless pit, but I think it's got the best level designs in all of SA2. The level design and the possibilities of what you can do and how you can reach the end of a stage strangely remind me of Sonic 1. And that's saying a lot considering they actually have a 3D version of Green Hill Zone in this fucking game. The Chao Gardens in SA1 and SA2 are pretty interesting, and I found it immensely rewarding to raise a Chao of my own and make him strong. They're just so cute, and I don't even like virtual pets in general, but this was done well. I had to backtrack and visit certain stages too many times to count to collect stuff for them to play with, but it was still so satisfying to see the little guys grow and succeed. Some won't be able to get into it, but I eventually did. The music in this game is actually very good, but it doesn't fit. On their own, most of these tunes are very well done. A lot of them simply don't fit in a typical Sonic game. Like I said last time, I'm sure Sonic himself loves rock music, but SA2's soundtrack isn't as universal sounding as SA1. We've got many different types of music, including rap. I think it's so hilarious and awesome that they snuck words like sexy and damn into Knuckle stages when you can hardly even hear them. Pop, rave, jazz, it's all okay, but they each lean a little too far in one direction or another, unlike SA1's upbeat electronic rock that fit the stages because they sounded more universal and not like they needed to fit a certain specific mood. Even though I can see why others might not enjoy this gritty soundtrack, I still kinda do. But hey, that's just me. I love Robotnik's music though. Lost Colony is haunting and ambient and sets a tone for pretty much the whole game, and I just adore Cosmic Wall. This is so intense and evil, but it's so freakishly epic. I've heard music in pornography that was more tame than this theme. I think this should be the definitive in-game song for Robotnik in the 3D games. I've never heard something this moody and climactic. It's just awesome. As for the voices, well, they're a mixed bag. I like most of them, and I don't think any of them are that unfitting for the characters. Sonic sounds a bit different this time, but he's energetic and eager to take on the world, and I liked Ryan Drummond this time. Knuckles was still cool and calm most of the time. Tails was meek but still determined, Rouge sounds nice, Robotnik was badass, and Shadow, well, I love his voice. See, a lot of little kids I know who watch Sonic X and play the more recent Sonic games prefer his second voice actor, Jason Griffith. You know why? They don't like his original English voice because it sounds too much like a real person. They like the way Griffith has made him some perpetual badass, and don't like his first voice actor because he sounds too ordinary and not emo enough. But that's exactly why I prefer David over Jason. He just sounds so much more genuine and soulful, but subtle and not like a freaky cartoon thing. If anything, I think Sonic characters should sound more like people, even if there aren't any humans around. The graphics are good, but not as colorful or surreal as those environments of the previous games, and frequently reused textures and settings do sometimes have a strange feeling of repetition, even though these are supposed to be over 30 environments. Some places are still beautiful though. I really like the in-game graphics cutscenes. Sometimes the characters' movements are kind of floppy, and they can only convey so much at a time, and the lip syncing is just awful, but there is an astonishing amount of expression at certain points. I especially love when their eyes get angry, and that one part where Rouge bites her lip. Considering the graphics and the models that were used, that freaked me out with its realism. One thing I found interesting was the use of G.U.N mechs instead of badniks. You only find in battle Robotnik's forces in a few stages, and spend most of the game fighting these tall, imposing-looking mechs. A lot of people hate this idea, but I commend Sega for it. Sure, I like the badniks, and they were always scary looking, but I still think they have too much in common with Sonic and his woodland friends because a lot of them still look like woodland critters as well. Sonic fights for nature and his children, so I think anything that attacks him should be as cold and mechanical as possible, to be distanced from him, rather than resembling him to any extent. Besides, it gives the Robotnik something to fight. Sonic has changed a lot over the years. In SA1 he was still pretty short, but here they made him look very gnarly. I'm gonna be honest, I kinda like Sonic's modern look, mainly because I adored the way Patrick Spaziante drew him in the early 2000s. Don't click that back button just yet. To the little gremlin I used to be, this was like pure badassery, concentrated into solid form. But even though I like the way that guy drew him, I hate the way Sega makes him look in their official art, and sometimes, yes, even in the games. I hate his teeny-weeny soulless pupils, his upper eyebrow that just screams, "You're gonna get raped!" and creepy smile of the later games. But I like him looking taller and having longer spines as long as they look like blades and not floppy bananas. I get it that he's supposed to be a cutesy little woodland critter, and that's why I liked his old look in the Genesis games like Sonic CD, because that made him more genuinely tragic and less serious business. But I really don't see what's wrong with him looking this way if Sega can make him less floppy. I wouldn't mind seeing him short and fat in a new game, and I don't prefer his new look over his old one, I just like it, period. See, when I grew up with these games, I didn't know he was officially 15 or 16. Because Sonic looked more like a toddler than anything else to me, I naturally assumed he was just a little kid in the Genesis games, which made me enjoy them even more because winning felt like more of an accomplishment than it would if he was an adult. And as his appearance changed, I subsequently assumed that it was because he was growing up. I know now this isn't really how it is, but I would be so happy if that was the case. I don't think all the 3D models are good though. Sometimes Sonic does look hideous to me, for various reasons. But it isn't because he has green eyes, and I don't mind him this time. Interestingly, if Sonic was still short, I don't think Shadow could exist, which I guess would be just fine. Unlike Sonic, Shadow needs long flaring spines because he's the embodiment of this whole extreme thing that was going on in the 90s, which was that decade's equivalent to 2000's serious business. I can't help thinking it would be interesting to see what an old school style Shadow would look like, but I still think it would be as inappropriate for him as his aesthetic is for Sonic. Anyways, because everything in this game was so unfamiliar to everything that came before it, I don't like to think of this as a true Sonic game. It's something outside the realm of what we were used to. I like to think that Sonic's world and our world are two separate things, that Gerald lived on our Earth and studied Mobius, and that this is where Robotnik was born, and that he left Earth to take over a seemingly defenseless Mobius, and that he eventually retreated back to Earth, and Sonic and Co. followed him to Earth. Again, that isn't really the case, but I think it should be. It's a cool, grand, epic, kick-ass adventure that Sonic and his friends just happen to be in. They don't really belong here, but they might as well go along for the ride. I do like this game, but not nearly as much as a lot of others do. With this, the 90s came to a close on a fair note, the days of old school Sonic ended, And even though a couple of games here and there were okay, we would not see another truly good Sonic game for a long time. Next time I blasted a fairly nostalgic, but almost universally despised thrill ride known as Sonic Heroes. Toodles!
Here I come, you creep! How are you? We almost got it. Hanging on the edge of tomorrow. Shadow, are you okay? You're unstoppable. Let's destroy this creature now. Everyone is waiting for us back on Earth. Alright, this is working. Sonic, how are you? We've almost got it.
Sonic, watch out! Colony is entering the atmosphere! Get out of there!
Did you really think you had a chance? No way that's getting through!
Shadow, I beg of you,
Maria!
give them a chance to be happy.
Now, Shadow! Chaos control!
Maria, this is what you wanted, right? This is my promise I made to you.